Well, this episode of Doctor Who did many things, most of them new for Doctor Who, but it did give us one thing that Doctor Who seemingly always has to give us now, which is doing a triumphant montage showing images of all the previous Doctors in a big climactic moment. Somehow we always got to have that, at least in one episode of every season of Doctor Who nowadays, it seems. Hello, interwebs. I hope you are all doing well, and I am here to review a truly excellent episode of Doctor Who titled The Story and the Engine. I believe the 5th episode of Series 2, or however you want to number it, of this show. So right up front, I kind of want to say this. I already know there's going to be so much that I am going to miss in discussing this episode. I think there's so much here that I'm excited to talk about and want to talk about. I think there's so much thematic depth, but frankly, I just have to say, because this episode is so deep, and because generally I film these reviews right after watching them, which sometimes to my benefit, I enjoy giving my fresh hot takes to all of you, but in other times I can feel like, oh man, there's so much I want to dig into, and this episode just has all of that. I really feel like there's so much depth to this episode, and on top of that, depth that is beyond my knowledge, because so much of this episode is rooted very much in Nigerian culture, African culture, blackness specifically, which I obviously know some amount of, but very much as an outsider, and this episode is so rooted in that in a beautiful, amazing way. And I really loved Doctor Who for doing this, because as much as I love Doctor Who and many of the franchises that I enjoy, they often come from a particular perspective, the culture that I come from, whether it be, Western culture, America, this show, British, similar things like that. And I just love it when a show like this actually depicts another culture authentically, not just an outsider perspective. That's something like Star Trek, for example, does a lot of the time, especially in older Treks, where it would depict a culture, but very much as an otherization. This episode clearly went to a playwright, and I want to make sure I get his name correct, Inu Elms. I mean, I'm probably mispronouncing it. I tried looking it up, but apologies. But he is a famous playwright who wrote a play called Barbershop Chronicles. And he was asked to do this Doctor Who episode. And it's very clear that he brought his background and culture and awareness, not only of barbershops, but also, his history. There's just so much depth in that is just beyond me. And I think that's a beautiful thing, because it's allowing this show to be a vehicle to engage others in experiencing other cultures on their own terms. And I love that. I love that so much when I get exposed to things that I don't know about in a beautiful way, in a joyous way. It makes me want to learn more and experience more, and shows me the limits of who I am and my awareness and just the multiplicity of humanity. So I love that for this. And I think that that's also just a core theme to a degree of this episode, of stories that interconnect, and how stories, connect us all in many different ways, but then how those stories sort of get claimed by others, and credit gets claimed by others, and it cuts us off from those connections and turns these tales into something that is kind of weaponized against others, and even against who we are. And I think that that's a really beautiful idea. Let me get into some of the specifics here. It's going to be hard. I usually try to go linearly through this, but there's so much here that I'm probably going to just bounce around. I, first off, love that the Doctor talks about how he likes to go to a black barbershop in Nigeria to feel like he has a home, especially, and he even calls it out that now that he has this black body that he hasn't had in a long time. And I really love that, because that is something that, again, I think, and I love Belinda bringing this up, that it's a human thing. The Doctor has lived in, for the most part, and we'll get to those exceptions in a minute, in white male-presenting bodies, which are generally on Earth and in the stories that Doctor Who centers, accepted in any space. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And here now, in this body, he isn't. He is seen as other in many of them. And so he seeks out a space where he feels accepted and can just be himself without feeling the judgment of the gaze of others on him, and just exist as a person. And that is a very universal experience, especially for marginalized people. As a trans person, feel that when I go into queer spaces, where I can just be and exist and not feel the eyes of how I'm othered by a culture that others me. And I think that's rooting that in a barbershop. I mean, obviously the playwright, the writer himself, is very much has a history of studying barbershops for his play, but also the history of storytelling and culture and community that is rooted in barbershops throughout Black culture. I very much know that through Black American culture. I actually didn't even know that was a big thing in African culture. I knew hair was and things like that, but that is that is kind of a thing that's also there. I really kind of love that as just an idea and really bringing in a story that can only be told through this specific kind of doctor, I thought was really wonderful, but again, connecting it to the universality of it. And then we get into this barbershop where there's this, guy who's using stories to fuel an engine. And I love this idea that kind of weaves throughout the episode of credit and stories that are taken and used by others for their own ends, for their own purposes, and how it distorts what the stories mean from their own original context. And we obviously get that in the main villain's quote unquote story, where he is like the guy, the storyteller behind all of these gods who have taken, his work, and he sort of, helped weave and connect them through all these cultures, and they sort of took credit for it. And didn't acknowledge him and his work and how much he did to connect these things to each other and connect humanity through them. They just claimed it for their own power and sense of, make them gods, to give them power, to give them strength, to give them, use stories to control others. And that's the metaphorical stuff here, but there's so much else throughout this that is referencing very specific things and dynamics that, especially oppressive dynamics over story and time, that get referenced here. Like, for example, there's that brief story one of the guys says where he talks about how, I think Yo-Yo Ma couldn't hear the same story again and again because the story is living and breathing. And so because the clouds are in a different spot, and, the gazelle, I think it was, or whatever the animal it was, wasn't in the right spot, the story changes and shifts. It's a breathing, living thing. And how colonization came and took it and commodified time. This idea that like time can be crystallized instead of ever moving, ever flowing. This is something I'm writing about for a project that I'm working on separately off of YouTube, but talking about queer time, for example, and queerness and how queer people view time. We have to constantly navigate our erased history, like queer history being erased, and we have to navigate our own sense of our own present as queer people, and how it's always constantly shifting and changing based on the world that we live in, and also our own story of navigating our own past because we were told to live one way, and now we are negotiating a different version of our story, and now we're always thinking about our future and the future that we want to build, but the future that we also have to live within. So like queer time is this whole thing, and how we queer people see things non-linearly, and how colonization has forced queer people to sort of live in this status quo of the present. And that's a thing that goes across all of how colonized people, how their stories have often been shoved into this colonized view of time that tries to take their stories and press it into their mold, whether it be this sort of Joseph Campbellian, monomyth, everything is just aligning into sort of Western culture's conception of stories as just like little offshoots of it, or how stories are seen as primitive or in the past or part of older people. Like you think of Catholicism, which like said like, we'll take all these other stories from all these other religions and say they're like prequels, or just incorporate them into Christianity to sort of buttress up our own narrative and institution to sort of claim these other people's. It's just a thing that happens very much, especially, and it gets referenced here specifically through African culture, which I think is important. But then we also get like him referencing the World Wide Web and the web that he built, the storyteller guy, the web that he built was sort of used to become the World Wide Web of humans, and like again this technology sort of taking over stories, and how it's been commodified and sort of made into something else and stolen from his creation. And then we also get Belinda's story that the doctor tells, which is this story that is about her saving someone and that person recognizing her, not giving it to the doctors, the ones in power who we usually give credit to, but to her as the nurse, like recognizing nurses are just as important to saving people's lives as doctors are, even though we always praise the doctors because they have the power. They are seen as sort of the ones in charge. And so it's just all these dynamics of how the stories and contributions of others are given to typically those in power who have control, whether it be colonization or those who just have a job over you through technology. Like it's a weaved throughout all of this. And I thought that was so beautiful. And then there's also, this idea of pain and trauma and hurt. Like the doctor blames the Omo who sort of led the doctor there because he thought the doctor could save them, but the doctor is forgiving him at the end of this. And even though he's saying like, you use me, you just saw me as someone to use to save you, and you didn't think about me. And Omo at the end being like, you're part of my community, I should have tried to protect you as well. And realizing that we're all interconnected again through all of these things. But also Anansi's daughter, I forget her name, being hurt as well. And she trying to lash out at the doctor and others and all of those things, but then ultimately coming to terms with like, no, she doesn't want to use her pain to destroy. Even the storyteller wants to destroy these gods, get revenge against them, which would hurt others as well, and just continue the hurt going on throughout, like, and compound it. Hurt people, and then those hurt people go on and hurt more people. It carries it on instead of creating a cycle of forgiveness and kindness and community. Like, we're going to hurt people, but how do we heal from that? How do we grow from that? And how do we, grow from the trauma of these people claiming and taking and pulling from us, and that history of pain? And I really loved that line that I think Belinda has, where she says, I think it's to Belinda, she says, the difference between good, and I wrote it down, the difference between good and evil is what we do with our pain. And I love that because, we live in a society that says to turn our trauma into trying to dehumanize ourselves, or to lash out at others, or to push others away, or to use our pain to delegitimize others. And you can see it in so many ways of how, fascism tries to traumatize us, so we ostracize ourselves from others and push each other away, or colonization tries to traumatize people through, literally colonizing them, their bodies, their histories and cultures, erase it. And it's about, what do we do when we have that pain? How do we build? How do we heal? How do we try to grow from that? And I thought that was just a really beautiful idea. And I love the doctor recognizing that, and the storyteller too is like, I know you're not trying to do something altruistic here to just take credit. You want to hurt and lash out at people, and recognizing that. But then at the end of the episode, still giving him kindness and reaching out to him, and wanting to save him as well, and getting to tell his own story and get his own credit and not steal from others, I thought was also beautiful. And I also, again, there's so much depth here. I'm just jumping all over the place. The reference to slavery that Anansi brings up, and like the way stories were told and had to be hidden through hair, like the importance of black hair and their black culture, and how it was used to tell stories through women. Women told those stories that way, and the importance of gender in that too. Just the ways in which, stories survive and grow and thrive, and not even necessarily thrive, but they continue, and they find new ways of being told, even in a world that tries to hurt and shove them down and use people's bodies just for control, and remove context, remove histories, remove their ability to connect to others. That's a lot of what colonization does. It tries to remove people from their history to sort of press them into use for the story that the colonizer is telling. And that's what slavery does, but people still find ways to try and hold on to culture, hold on to identity, and help each other and tell stories to each other to try to escape, and what stories mean to as a way to escape in both, not just in escapism ways, but a literal escape through hair. And again, there's just so much here that I know I'm not gonna get to all of, but it's just frankly beautiful. And the other idea, I was talking about credit earlier, this isn't just, it just reminded me, because I'm a YouTuber, of H. Bomber Guy, when he was talking about in his plagiarism video, and one of the biggest harms that plagiarism causes is it removes people's access to the original work. And it's not just removing people's credit, but people being able to connect and grow from those connections from those works. But when James Somerton erased the people that he stole from, especially from people that died from HIV or their work wasn't as well known, it removed the ability to engage with James's work to connect back to that history, to the queer past that he stole from and plagiarized from. And that was an even bigger harm and hurt. And I don't mean to just bring in James Somerton. This is what all of these things that Doctor Who is gesturing at in this episode are doing, not just James Somerton, but it's just the one that I immediately think of because it's the one that, is related to me in terms of the space that I'm in. And I have a personal connection to, but enough about that. But yeah, it made me think of that. But also there's the big thing that I also really loved in this episode is the brief appearance of Joe Martin as the fugitive doctor. And I think it's very important and very wonderful that the other Black Doctor that we have seen and the woman Black Doctor that we have seen get to take part in this story. And it shows the continuity of the Doctor's stories and identities and who they are. I think it was really important to see her here. Yeah, I'm kind of jumping around thematically. With all of these ideas. I mean, there's stuff that I love too, just the back and forth between all these people telling stories, the specifics of the production design of I love the barbershop, razor, shear, I should say, that has the carving on it. It looked beautiful. The art direction was really, really wonderful. Just all of those things are weaved throughout this. Gosh, this was just such... I've said this a billion times, but this is such a dense episode, and I'm sitting here being like, man, have I touched on everything? I mean, I really just stayed thematic. I haven't talked as much about plot, but I liked the Doctor, getting called in, again, being tricked in there and forgiving the guy, figuring out that the man was lying and them trying to escape, and that stories were the heart. Oh, this is the thing that I wanted to get to, was the Doctor telling his story, a 6-word story. And I like that, he gave the idea to Hemingway. Again, people connecting, the recursive thing there of people being influenced by each other, and we shouldn't be tearing that apart. And so I like that. But then his story being, 6 words, I live, I die. I forget exactly what the 6 words were. Though, by the way, I will notice he says I'm in his, I'm reborn, I think was his last sentence. But in the captions, it said I am born. It didn't have the contraction. So technically it was 7 words if you looked at the subtitles, which kind of threw me for a second. But he did say I'm. So it is technically 6 words. But the subtitles did not follow through on that, which is a weird thing for the subtitles to have done, considering how textual the 6-word reference is. Anyways, it's, again, this idea that stories continually change and morph. Just like the Doctor, who continually changes and morphs over time, and just like Doctor Who itself changes and morphs over time and becomes new things, the 11th Doctor said, you always change, you're always becoming new people, you got to keep moving. That's what the Doctor says here. He's constantly changing form, but the story and the connections go on. Even though they're new stories, they're all interweaved and connected with each other in this continuity of existence in humanity. And even though it's a multiplicity of self, the story changes, the story morphs. You can't tell the same story over and over and over again, and yet they are all connected to each other even within our own lives. This way I tell a story will always change based on the context of who I am in the moment, but I will always it'll always be part of who I am, what those stories all were, my history, and weaving throughout my existence and the connections that I have made to others who influence me and change me. And I like that being here too. So yeah, I think I'm going to wrap out on this because ultimately I'll just keep babbling about how beautiful I think the thematics of this are. The plot of it's great, but there's just so much depth that my mind is racing through in this story that is gestured at, hinted at, explored, but in ways that, the story is itself. This is focused on this fun adventure tale of this guy going to the center of this web to try and destroy gods, right? But it's a story that glimpses at and gestures at these histories of slavery, colonization, and the use of time and credit in big and small ways, whether it be in a hospital at an everyday job or these long histories of trauma inflicted upon bodies, marginalized bodies, racialized bodies, that I really loved. And this is the last thing that I'll say on this. I think this is the best usage that Doctor Who has gotten out of its mythical, magical shift that we've gotten since the Toymaker stories. Since the Toymaker, or even theoretically since before that in Wild Blue Yonder, where, the Doctor invoked a superstition at the edge of the galaxy. Doctor Who has, in Russell T Davies' second term, become much more about magic and myth, and storytelling and gods and all that sort of stuff, rather than the more quote unquote science-based Doctor Who stuff. Quote heavy air quotes on the science base, but at least gesturing towards science. And I think this is the first episode to me that really feels like it engages in the depth of that, beyond just like, we're fighting a god now who has undefined powers, maybe I'm missing some, but it really feels like this was the best usage of that. And I love all those other types of stories too, don't get me wrong, but this is like when it like really drills down into the essence of what fantasy and magic can do, especially when you're using it through a culture that I don't know as much about. So yeah, I'm going to go out and read a lot about this episode, about all the things that I missed just because of the cultural specificity. But in terms of the thematics and things that it touched upon as things that I resonate deeply with as a queer person, as a marginalized person, as a woman, as a trans person, there are things that it touches upon that I've been thinking about a lot lately, that this episode touches upon. And it speaks to the connections that are made across cultures, across identities, that even though this is rooted in very specific cultures that is not mine, I feel connection to it in a deep way, and I hope others do too. Because I think what this episode does is a beautiful, important thing that we need right now in terms of connecting stories and ideas, rather than trying to force it all into this colonial or fascist myth that tries to traumatize us all and ostracize ourselves from each other. Anyways, I hope you all, my friends, live long and prosper.